Hello, everybody. Welcome to our week here. I'm going to share my screen. All right, and the PowerPoint. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to be talking about Erickson's psychosocial theory, and I'm going to walk you through the stages of his theory, and then what you're going to do for the assignment, either on your own or in your study group, you're going to submit an assignment where you define the dilemma and the age range of each of Erickson's stages. So the age range and a basic definition of each of the stages. And then I want you to provide a story from the life of one real person you personally know per stage. So if you're working in your study group, any one of you could know this person, and then you don't have to provide one person for each of you, just one person. But what I really want to know is the story that illustrates the dilemma or the crisis of the stage. That'll make more sense once we get into the content. So this right here is the assignment. These are just further items on the study guide. So, but this right here is the assignment. Okay, so keep that in mind as we're going through each of the stages to make sure that it's clear to you. Okay, so here we are. And we're going to talk about Erickson's psychosocial theory. We're going to do it fairly briefly, and then you will apply it in your study groups or on your own to tell me a story of each stage. Okay, so there are eight dilemmas. And so Erickson's theory is about how we become a fully expressed version of ourselves. How do we become psychologically mature? And he says that our self is developed in relationship to others. So the self circle here, the blue one, is your understanding, your identity. So the identity of your own self, and the way it's developed is by handling these dilemmas in combination, in cooperation, in collaboration with others. And so according to Erickson, we develop into the person that we're going to be through our interactions with others. And the specific interactions that you go through at each stage that help to develop yourself as a person are these dilemmas. So, for example, the very first dilemma happens in infancy, and that is trust versus mistrust. And that particular dilemma is foundational. And in fact, you'll see on the study guide that attachment styles is another question, like asking you about the different kinds of attachment. And that attachment work is part and parcel of the very first dilemma, which is trust versus mistrust. So it basically comes down to, do you believe fundamentally that the world is a safe place? Your understanding of that extremely fundamental belief about the world happens during infancy via the crisis or the dilemma that Erickson calls trust versus mistrust. So as a child, when you are, just born, do you experience that when you have a need, your needs are met? If you experience that when you have a need, your needs are met, by and large, not always. I mean, nobody's perfect. No mother is able to, prevent her child from crying every single time something goes awry. So like nobody's needs are met the instant they have them. But by and large, if you've got a need, by and large, does your need get met? That is at the heart of trust versus mistrust. If the baby's needs are not really met, they will develop a fundamental sense of mistrust, that the world is not a safe place, that their needs will not be met. If the baby's needs are generally met, they develop a fundamental sense of trust that the world is a relatively safe place, and and that their needs are just by and large going to be met. So when you're looking into the questions around attachment, you'll get more depth into the kinds of experiences, how that specific piece of your identity is formed. So if this one doesn't make total sense to you just yet, then it's worth it to take a deep dive into the attachment literature so that you're able to get that kind of depth that you're looking for. And then when you're filling out the specific dilemma about trust versus mistrust, you'll have more depth to pull from. So that is my recommendation to you for this particular one. Read and answer the questions about attachment, and then you'll have an even deeper understanding. The next dilemma is autonomy versus shame, and this happens as a toddler. So this starts at around age 2 and goes until what we call school age is the next one, or preschool, so around age 4. So this one, autonomy versus shame and doubt, happens between about roughly ages 2 and 4. And you'll see that each of these, of course, has one way that the dilemma can resolve that's negative. So if in one way that the dilemma can resolve, which is positive. So in trust versus mistrust, you're going to form a fundamental belief, which happens in every stage. In the fundamental belief, if you form it and it's trust, that's a positive resolution of the dilemma. You have a question, it's answered in the positive, and you move forward in a healthier state. In this one, the question is, am I autonomous, or should I feel shameful that I acted autonomously? So this is where the child tries to begin to act on their environment. So at around age 2, the child can begin to speak and act on their environment, and how the mother or father or caretaker or set of caretakers, how they respond to the child's effort to act on their environment, to grab the bottle and throw it on the ground, or point and scream for a rattle to be brought to them. If the child is treated like their autonomy is a good thing, that they have an autonomous thought, that they have a desire, that they have a, initiative, although that's the word for the next one. They have some sort of they want to make an effort on their world. If they're treated like that's a good thing, then they will develop a healthy sense of autonomy, or I am my own person with my own desires. Then they will resolve in the direction of autonomy. If they're made to feel shame about that, if mom's like, why are you making such a mess? Or I told you not to do that, or go, time out for you for doing all these things. Now, some things the baby cannot do, and it's okay to have, it's okay for you to have barriers, boundaries, rules. Those things are all okay. And again, all of these, we all experience both sides, right? In the trust versus mistrust, it's true that the world sometimes meets your needs and sometimes doesn't. And it's okay and true that sometimes you can act autonomously and sometimes you shouldn't. It's about the balance that you find. If you find yourself unbalanced as a toddler, that your autonomy is treated with respect, then you'll ultimately have a belief that your own impulses are important. So, and if you don't, then you'll have shame and doubt over your own autonomous impulses. And that, as you can imagine, leads to it being more likely that when you become a preschool student, like 4, 5, what are you experiencing? Are you experiencing, do you come into this phase likely to act on your own initiative? Or do you feel guilt over having initiative? So the first 3 of these, well, this, not the very first one, trust versus mistrust, although that one's fundamental to basically everything. But the one in the toddler age, autonomy versus shame, and then this one, initiative, and the next one, industry, they're very much the same dilemma played out with different ages of kids. Basically, it's like, can I act of my own accord? And as my abilities grow, can I act with greater, can I act with more strategy? Can I complete bigger projects? Can I not just want something? Can I plan to have it? Can I coordinate a bigger project? So when you are a toddler, you just want something, and is that okay? When you get to preschool, you start to make a plan. Can I make plans to get what I want? Is what happens in preschool, or do I feel guilt for wanting that thing? So this is where the child might, really wants a cookie and will wait until mom is going to the bathroom to get the cookie, right? There's like a plan here. I'm going to wait. Maybe I'll even lure her out of the kitchen. Mom, go look out the window. I think there's a dinosaur. And mom goes, and then he gets the cookie, right? So there's like a plan in place. There's initiative in an effort to get that plan to fruition. So as a toddler, you just want something. As a preschooler, you make a plan. And in both cases, if you're treated negatively for having those plans, you're less likely to move into the next stage in a positive way. So, like I said, as a toddler, you want something. As a preschooler, you make a plan. By the time you get to your elementary school years, which is basically concrete operations in Piagetian terms, you can begin to marshal resources. You can take on bigger projects. You might decide, I'm going to read this book, and then I'm going to apply the principles, and I'm going to read this book about carpentry, and then I'm going to build myself a treehouse, or I'm going to read this book on web design, and I'm going to make myself a blog. Those kinds of things become available to you in elementary school in a way they weren't before, for all the reasons concrete operations is a stage. At school, it can mean things like, I'm going to write a book report instead of just filling out a worksheet, right? They're bigger projects. And this is where things start to get a little more serious. If you can't do that in elementary school, then it becomes difficult for you to do the projects required by schooling, right? Like the larger projects, the book reports, the science experiments, those bigger projects that start to happen in the upper elementary school years, they become really difficult because you don't have the proper industry. And it's not your fault necessarily, because remember, a lot of it comes from the way that you were treated in preschool and as a toddler, and maybe most of all as an infant, formulating trust versus mistrust. So when you get to this industry versus inferiority, where you're also landing is in that place of a growth mindset, which we talked about last time. So if you do something, if you've got this big plan and you struggle at it, you will end up feeling inferior in this phase if you have a fixed mindset, and more industrious if you have a growth mindset. So much the way attachment is sort of this complementary theory to the very first of Erickson's psychosocial dilemmas, the growth mindset really adds a layer of richness to this industry versus inferiority elementary school psychosocial stage of Erickson's. So when you're trying to understand what we mean here, if you start to do something and you fail and you feel inferior, all the stuff we learned about the fixed mindset and how, some people are smart and some people aren't, like that is what you're feeling when you're feeling inferior, versus industry, where you feel like, if I put in effort over time, I will be able to succeed. That is the industry side of this particular dilemma. And then you enter adolescence, which Erickson tells us is the time when you begin to make Sorry. It's the time when you will begin to make sorry, the phone rang and then I got a text message and now I've lost my train of thought. My apologies. Okay. So Erickson tells us that adolescence is when we begin to make our own identity, where we begin to really become our own person. The process of identity versus role confusion is one of where, when you're in elementary school, you probably remember this, you basically absorb your identity like a sponge from the people around you. Like your mom tells you who you are, your teachers tell you who you are, and you just assume that they're right, like that is in fact what is true. When you become an adolescent, however, you sort of flip the lens on that and you begin to question if you really are who everybody thinks you are. And in fact, you begin to question bits and pieces of yourself. So your identity is the combination or accumulation of lots of commitments that you make, right? Like, I am a good student is a commitment that you make, but you may also ask the question of like, am I really more of an artist? Am I really more of an athlete? Am I social? Am I pro-socially minded? Am I a Democrat? Am I a liberal? Am I a Red Sox fan or a Yankees fan? Like, you just make all of these little commitments, each piece of which contributes to your identity. And if you're able to make commitments that feel like they're all part of a single whole, you will feel like you have arrived at an identity. If each of the pieces of your identity feel at odds with each other, you'll have role confusion. Now, the most important part to remember about adolescence is everybody goes through role confusion. Whereas with the other psychosocial dilemmas, not everybody goes through a real crisis of mistrust before they get to trust, or a crisis of inferiority before they get to industry. That's where adolescence is a little bit different. Everyone goes through role confusion. Everyone fractures their identity and takes on a piece and starts behaving differently with this group than that group. Everybody does that. The real question is whether or not you resolve the dilemma in the direction, like whether you move out into your 20s as a mostly coherent person or as a mostly incoherent person, like with a lot of role confusion, where you're like, I am both a good student and a party girl, or I am both a Red Sox fan and a Yankees fan, which actually is more of a joke. I am somebody who is very reliable, but I'm also somebody who doesn't like to make commitments, right? Those things are in tension with each other. And if you can resolve those and land somewhere, and that all the pieces of your identity kind of cohere with each other and you feel like a complete whole person, then you've arrived at identity. Versus role confusion, which is where bits and pieces of your identity are actually in tension with each other. And that's what's happening in adolescence, which is actually why it's such a tumultuous time, why it feels so uncomfortable for everybody, because you're really questioning each part of yourself. And then there are 7 questions that Erickson says that we answer in order to resolve the dilemma of identity versus role confusion, like 7 things that you grapple with. And it might be helpful to look at those 7 issues of identity, things like time, things like potential careers. Like there's a list of 7. And if you look at them, it might help you to understand, like, what does it really look like to go through the dilemma of identity versus role confusion? That's a good place to look if you're still not sure about this one. And then you exit adolescence and you enter early adulthood, or what's sometimes referred to as emerging adulthood. It says in your early 20s, by and large, it's where you guys probably are right now. And the question becomes intimacy versus isolation. So as you emerge out of adolescence with either a coherent or incoherent identity, either a coherent identity or a feeling of role confusion, you enter your 20s better able, if you have a coherent identity, able to seek intimacy. So you can see how these are really building on each other. If you feel really inferior in your early educational years, and then you continue to have an incoherent identity through adolescence, you would arrive in early adulthood not so sure about who it is you're sharing. And intimacy, right, as a term, is the ability to know who I am, feel seen for who I am, and loved for who I am. But if you don't know who you are, then you can't be seen for who you are and loved for who you are, right? So if intimacy is being loved for who you actually are, you have to know who that is. If you don't, because you're still very confused about your roles, intimacy will be a very difficult thing to achieve. So what tends to happen is if you're still not sure who you are and you don't resolve those things, you end up feeling fairly isolated. I'm not sure who I am. And then when I attempt to connect with others, they're looking for something deeper that I can't show them yet. And so you end up kind of isolated, not having a strong sense of intimacy. And that happens in early adulthood, probably like in your early 20s. When you reach middle adulthood, which is more like 32 to 55, these ages start to get much less concrete and much more kind of descriptive, sort of your middle years. You enter what we refer to as the generativity versus stagnation stage or dilemma, which is where now that you have intimacy, you can, like in your early 20s, you're sort of obsessed with finding a mate, or many people are, trying to find somebody who loves you for who you are so that you can begin to generate a life with that person. And if you didn't find intimacy, then you're generating your legacy on your own, which is more difficult. Especially, Erickson is an old school theorist, and as far as he was concerned, generativity for women basically means like having babies. So like that's hard to do without a man in the picture, at least to contribute his portion of the chemistry. But either way, regardless of whether you are heterosexual or in a relationship or want children, this dilemma more broadly is about, are you going to contribute? Are you going to generate a legacy? So that's a good word to use to describe the generativity versus stagnation dilemma. Are you going to create a legacy, or are you going to feel like you're just kind of standing still, spinning your wheels, not making a difference, not building anything, still pretty broke, all of that kind of stuff? Is which of those are you going to go towards? And if you begin to feel like you're actually, I'm accomplishing something, I'm making a difference, I'm contributing to conversations in my field, or I'm creating a family, or I'm participating in my children's lives, whatever it is, you begin to feel generative. Now, some people have children when they're in their isolation versus intimacy phase. So if you have kids really early in life, some people find intimacy in their children. Those are the people who love them for who they are. And it's very possible also to feel isolated, even though you have children. So it's not really about the circumstance of the life, right? It's more about psychologically how you're perceiving yourself. Am I feeling seen and loved, or am I feeling alone and misunderstood? And then up here, it's really not about like whether you have a lot of money and are generating money and kids. It's more about, do I feel like I'm creating a legacy? Am I contributing with my life, or am I feeling stagnant? And wherever you land in there leads pretty clearly to the last of the dilemmas, which is integrity versus despair. Am I feeling, and this is of the late adulthood piece, am I feeling like the arc of my life so far, as you approach your death, do you feel like the arc of your life is one that you lived with integrity, that you were authentic, that you were generative, that you were, well, let's see, that you were generative, that you had intimacy, that you had a strong identity, that you had industry, that you had initiative, that you had autonomy, and you had trust? Did you have those things? If you did, then you're likely to feel integrity about your life. If instead you felt like I didn't really create much of a legacy, and I never really felt like I deeply connected with another person in that intimate way, I'm still not totally sure who I am, or I feel like I can be multiple things. I feel fairly inferior about my abilities. I feel guilt about my initiative. I feel shame about my autonomy. If all of those things are true, then despair is likely the conclusion here of your psychosocial development. And it's sad. It's very sad when you see people in late adulthood feeling despair. And in fact, it's very hard to see people going through stagnation in middle adulthood, because you can just see despair in the horizon. You want them to go back and build intimacy and start to generate some legacy for themselves. But not everybody does, and that lands you in late adulthood with either a sense of integrity or a real feeling of despair at the end of your life. So Erickson's theory ends there, right? His lifespan theory. Most of what we've been talking about so far is sort of development theory, which is like once you're fully developed, you're done. Whereas Erickson says that you develop your psychosocial identity your whole life. And it starts as an infant and carries you through until your death. So that's Erickson's psychosocial development theory. I want you now to, in your alone or in your study groups, to think about each of these stages. And for each stage, it doesn't have to be the same person, because you're not old enough to have watched somebody go through every stage of their life. So look around you and find an infant and think about whether or not that child feels a sense of trust or a sense of mistrust. And don't skip the part where you learn about attachment, because attachment is really what helps you understand the depth of trust versus mistrust. It's not just, it seems like it would be the case that if you can give the baby to their uncle and the baby is comfortable with the uncle, that would give a really strong sense of trust. But actually that is a clear indicator of mistrust. So make sure you read through the attachment stuff and watch the videos that are in this PowerPoint on these slides here. So let me bring them up. Here's some attachment videos. Here's some descriptions of attachment. Here's some videos to watch. There are many other videos as well. Watch those so that you have a really good understanding of trust versus mistrust when you're trying to figure out whether the infant that you're using in your description is landing in the camp of trust versus mistrust. Then, think of a toddler, think of a preschooler, think of an early childhood, etc. Consider your own adolescence or your friends. Consider your own early adulthood or your friends. Think about someone you know in middle age and somebody who's older. And just spend some time creating stories that fit those stages. And that is what I want you to do. Erickson's theory is important to me. I think it's a really great way to understand the overall lifespan development, and especially in these early stages, to understand how to sort of place the growth mindset, which we talked about last time, in a larger theoretical domain. So I want you to really spend some time thinking about this people you know and trying to understand this theory through that application. So that's what I want you to do, and I want you to put it into Classroom. There will be an assignment that says upload your Erickson psychosocial development assignment here. You will upload actually I'll give you, here, let me see if it's actually on the second page of this study guide. Yes, here it is. So you'll have this thing where you put your trust versus mistrust, right? You'll write the age and the description and the example in here. And obviously these can get as long as you want them to be. So don't feel like you have to only use the amount of space I've given you. So fill out this table and upload it to Google Classroom with your stories and your descriptions. And thank you so much for being flexible with this, and I'll see you next week for our last class. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I will talk to all of you again very soon. And I'll see you next week.